History as sausage making. Well, making sausages can be messy. It can also be, I think, a collective effort, as we can see here in this wonderful slide. But I wanted to just briefly go over some thoughts on the analytical essay and some paper guidelines for your paper that is coming due this week. First of all, please read the assignment and guidelines carefully and follow them. I try to be as clear as possible about my expectations, and if you have any questions, please let me know. I have also supplied the link to the Chicago Manual of Style, also sometimes referred to as quite fondly as the Turabian, under materials. And the Chicago Manual of Style, the Turabian style, is what you need to use for your footnotes or your endnotes. It depends on if you have your citations at the bottom of the page or at the end of your essay. And please use this format, and I would recommend, if you are a history major and you're going on to the senior seminar, to purchase a copy of this book. I think you could probably get a pretty inexpensive used copy. So I recommend getting a hold of it because it's probably going to be easier to rifle through that than to be looking online. So the analytical essay, the topic, it asks you to use the assigned readings from the first 5 weeks of this course. So again, this is important to remember that you are going to demonstrate your understanding of this question based on the assigned readings. So please don't go far afield and start looking online for things, and stay focused on what we've read in class, because it's about how you have used these sources to address this question, or these questions, I should say. So this is a sort of a packed topic that you're supposed to be looking at. I won't read the whole thing, but I think that the last sentence is maybe a crucial statement for you to use in trying to set up your analytical essay, and that is to consider the issues of theory, methodology, and sources, and discussing the challenges historians face in studying the past and its meaning. So when you're looking at the challenges that history faces and historians face, make sure that you frame it in terms of theory and methodology and sources. Some tips. Answer the question that's given. That seems fairly obvious, but not always. Answer the question that is given and answer it using specific illustrative support. Make sure you provide support, specific support, and then analyze the significance of the support used. And be aware of nuanced arguments made in the readings. You need to make sure you have a sophisticated reading of these assigned texts. Strong topical sentences are essential to be able to have strong, clear writing. And make sure, because this is sometimes something that I see often as a stumbling block in papers, the first time that a source is used, you use the full citation, but then after you do the first full citation, you do not do a full citation. You use an abbreviated form. And again, you should see the Chicago Manual of Style for correct citation for all things. Thucydides' Tower, words of caution. I think it's important to remember that Thucydides was not wrong. Looking at politics was not wrong. It just limited his perspective. And so make sure when you're discussing escaping Thucydides' Tower that you don't run roughshod over Thucydides. He was not wrong, but rather showed the interests and concerns of his day. Much like in the medieval period, the focus was on religion, and in the 20th century, social issues, identities, movements come to the forefront. Looking at Pericles, such as Thucydides did in his History of the Peloponnesian War, was not wrong. It was very useful. It was brilliantly done, but it did limit him from looking at other issues, such as the rowers. But that was not his intentions. He was clearly looking at something different than what we would call social history now. And social history, when it comes about, and we've looked at that in previous weeks, created new towers or dismantled the old tower, I don't know what you want to say it created. You might want to think about it. It created different quarters, anyway, and attempted to create a more complete history. Whether this is true or not is something we can debate. What is pretty evident, though, is that with the rise of social history is that different questions are being asked. And so political history and social history, cultural history, intellectual history, imperial history, these types of histories, what makes them a certain kind of history is because they ask certain kinds of questions. They use sources in a certain kind of way, and they use certain kinds of sources. So it's about what questions are asked, what sources are used, and how those sources are used are very important distinction for how historians look at the past. And I wanted to just add a few more words about social history, or history from the bottom up, for you to consider for your analytical essay. Again, it's heavily influenced by Marxism, and so for social history, it sees economics as one of the sort of key building blocks in understanding history, where political history naturally would see war, diplomacy as sort of the essential building block. And social history focuses on the everyday life. It asks different questions, and some of the questions that are particularly of interest for social historians is the question of power, but a different kind of power. There's construction of power structures beyond high politics, but power structures based on other kinds of relationships. Social history looks at how identities are created, how class, race, gender, ethnicity are created and acted upon, how people use private spaces rather than just public spaces. There's also great interest of microhistories, of looking at specific peasant villages and their records, or specific working class communities, or women's collectives, looking very minutely, using sort of a microscope to examine their lives. Social history is seen as a democratization of history because it reflects different kinds of questions of history from the bottom up. And partly this rise of social history is because of the mass politics of the 20th century, and people began to ask new questions and have new areas of interest. And just to give you a list of some of the areas that are of interest to social historians, they include, well, essentially any marginalized group can be plugged into social history. The peasantry, the working class, women, the crowd, followers and supporters, the colonized, slaves, children, prisoners, resistance, madness, especially with cultural history, gays and lesbians, African Americans, Mexican Americans, natives and indigenous peoples, deviants, radicals, and the list continues. And so I think you can get a sense of the wide range of interest social historians then have in terms of looking at the people that were not looked at before, people that previously had been invisible, not seen as important enough to be included in the history book. And with the rise of social history, people then are considered to not be passive, but rather that they're agents of history and that they create themselves, that they are agents of themselves, and it's not necessarily the great men that are the movers of history, but the marginalized people also are very important. One way to look at it is there would be no Stalinism with only Stalin, or no Nazism with only Hitler. That they need not only supporters, but many times these people are really pushing forward these ideas. So the problems of this. Well, it has been argued one of the problems with social history is that it creates a lot of trees, but no real forest. It's hard to kind of step back and see what all of this new work has created in terms of what Marc Bloch had hoped to be a total history. There's many particulars, but there's no sort of total history. And it has been argued that there's a need to synthesize and link history from the bottom up to the top down. And in your materials, there is an article by Ronald Gregor Suni, Toward a Social History of the October Revolution, which is an old article, 1983, but it's a really excellent look at the differences between political history and social history. I urge you to look at this to really get sort of an understanding of how they work, the kinds of questions they ask, and also possible ways that there might be a synthesis. And these sausages sort of represent sausages that aren't together on a plate versus sausages that are more close together and on a plate. And I guess that's what we want to try to do with history, is get those histories so that they are more nestled together on a plate like these sausages, because unfortunately, oftentimes history gets very compartmentalized like all these various sausages. So how to bring the histories together like how to bring these sausages together. Is that a bit of a stretch? Perhaps it is. One other comment I wanted to make about history as a profession that you need to be mindful of for this paper, that history is not just the facts, never has been, never will be. History is much more than just presenting facts. That would be chronicles. Historians interpret the past. They use the facts to try to get as close to what Arnold calls true stories of the past. They have been trained to read the past and analyze its meanings and nuances. And they know how to read evidence from the past. They're sophisticated in that. They've been trained. They do not take sources at face value. So, as I've mentioned before, in terms of postmodernism, that historians are far more probably sophisticated than postmodernists would like to admit. You may disagree with a historian's interpretation, and I'm sure you will, because we all disagree with what other historians have said. A historian needs to be careful that a historian uses evidence properly, and you can disagree with a historian's interpretation of evidence. And you can even question if a historian has used evidence ethically and correctly by checking their sources, and that's why citations are so important. But it is also very important to be civil in your discourse. Don't attack an historian just because you disagree with them. And you might refer back to the AHA Statement of Standards in terms of the sense of discourse and community of history, that historians see themselves as part of a community that loves and values history, even though they might disagree with each other. And so here we have, can we all get behind the counter and have our sausages or history together under the same glass? I don't know. Is total history possible? Is it even desirable to have a total history? Something to think about. Can history, like sausages and other meat products, exist in harmony? Well, it's something to think about, and that's if you read Suni's article on social history and towards a October Revolution, is how desirable is it to have consensus in history? That I think actually having tension, debate, not agreeing with each other is actually a sign of strength of history, and that consensus is maybe not as desirable in history as it might be in some fields. But I would argue that most disciplines you don't want consensus. It's good to have that dynamic intellectual tension to be able to continue to be innovative and think about new ways to explore and engage your discipline. Well, these are just some ideas I wanted to have you think about for this paper. But it's important to remember that history as a discipline is not static. It is dynamic and it changes. It changes due to political tendencies, technological advances, the use of cross-disciplinary ventures, new methods and theories, new way of thinking, and new conflicts come up. So history is always changing, and we shouldn't be concerned about that it's changing. We should be concerned if it doesn't change. I look forward to reading your essays, and good luck with them.